Authentication. Nowadays, the security of your servers is one of the highest priorities you can have, sometimes even to the detriment of functionality. Every time a client accesses your website, it needs to be authenticated before it can access the resources that it's requesting. By default, that authentication all takes place on the server, and the user requesting access isn't even involved. Now, IIS 6 supports 5 main methods of authentication. Anonymous authentication, which, as the name implies, doesn't require any sort of username and password. Basic authentication. Digest and advanced authentication, which provides more security than basic authentication, but not as much as Windows integrated authentication. And finally, there's Microsoft's .Dotnet Passport authentication. Now, the first type of authentication we'll look at is anonymous authentication. So we'll fire up the IIS MMC by clicking on Start, Administrative Tools, and then we'll launch Internet Information Services Manager. Now we'll come over here to the left and we'll expand our server, and then we'll right click on Websites and select Properties. Then we'll select the Directory Security tab, and underneath the Authentication and Access Control heading, we'll select the Edit button. Now at the top of this window, you'll notice that the anonymous authentication is configured by default. Now notice the account which is configured to access resources on behalf of an anonymous user. You see, anonymous authentication allows a user to access web and FTP sites without having to provide a username and password. Now normally when you visit a website, unless it requires you to be a member or sign in to access protected content, you'll just access it without providing any sort of details at all. So when a client accesses a web or FTP site, IIS uses this Internet Guest account to authenticate that user. This Internet Guest account is created automatically when IIS is installed, and it's named IUser followed by an underscore followed by the name of the server. Now when it comes to anonymous authentication, you must realize that this account must be granted permissions to access content on your server, because the user accessing your site has no permissions at all, and this account is what fetches the content and sends it back to them. So if you have problems accessing content that an anonymous user should be able to access, then ensure that the account IUser followed by the underscore followed by the host name of your server has the appropriate permissions on your system. Now one thing to be aware of, if you happen to rename your IIS server, this Internet Guest account will not change and still will use the old machine name. And that's because user accounts use security identifiers or SIDs to identify themselves. So changing the computer name doesn't affect this account name. So this IIS server is called Server 01. Therefore, if I was to rename this server to Server 02, this Internet Guest account will still be called IUser underscore Server 01. Now you can change this account to a different account if you wish. You're not bound by using this IUser account. You could even use the administrator account if you really wanted to, but we certainly don't recommend that you do that. Just ensure whatever account you use has the right permissions to access content that it should be able to access and no permissions to anything else. Now when IIS receives a request, by default it automatically attempts anonymous authentication first. If this authentication fails, it then attempts to log on the user using another authentication method. That's if you've got one configured. Now if you don't have any of these other authentication methods enabled, IIS will send a 403 access denied HTTP error message to the client. Now the next authentication method IIS will try if anonymous authentication fails is integrated Windows authentication. And we can see here that by default integrated Windows authentication is checked. Now with integrated Windows authentication it's pretty secure, but it requires the user to be running Internet Explorer, and it requires the user's browser to prove itself to the server using a cryptographic exchange during the authentication process. In Active Directory domains, the client PC, if it's running Windows 2000 and above, this authentication will use Kerberos version 5. If it's an older operating system being used, then NT LAN Manager will be used to provide authentication. Now next we have digest authentication, but I'm going to skip that for a moment and we'll talk about basic authentication first. Basic authentication is very weak as far as security goes, but it's easily implemented and it's widely supported because passwords are sent over the network in clear text. Now when you authenticate using basic authentication, you'll type in a username and password and then it's base64 encoded by your browser and sent off to the server. IIS simply verifies that the username and password are correct and then lets you access the resources. To be able to use basic authentication, users need to have an account on either the local web server or the domain, and then the access control is defined through NTFS permissions. Now, one of the problems with basic authentication, aside from these clear text passwords, is that IIS keeps a token cache for logons, and this token is used by IIS for up to 15 minutes to impersonate the user when it needs to access data. Now, caching these tokens does improve performance as you no longer need to authenticate every time, but it poses an additional security risk as a determined attacker could get access to the token cache. Now, you can turn off token cache if you want the additional security, but you will need to do this through the registry. So to do this, we'll click on Start, Run, and we'll type in regedit and click on OK. Then we'll expand our HKey local machine, System, Current control set, Services, and we'll scroll down here until we can see the INET info key. We'll expand that and then we'll select parameters. Now what we're looking here for is a D-word value called user token TTL. If it doesn't exist, that's okay, we'll just add in this key ourselves. So we'll come over here and we'll right click on our parameters key, we'll select new, D-word value, and we'll just give it a name of user token TTL. Now just ensure that this here has a value of 0. Now what you'll need to do is restart IIS and it will no longer cache authentication tokens. Now by the way, as weak as basic authentication is, you can improve the security by using the SSL protocol. And this will encrypt all data, including passwords, as it travels over the network. Now a slightly better method of authentication than basic is digest authentication, which is available if you're using Active Directory accounts. Digest authentication improves on basic in that passwords traveling over the network are encrypted. The problem with digest authentication is that the domain controller stores these passwords in plain text, which is obviously not very secure. Now, if you're going to use regular digest authentication, do ensure that your domain controller is kept secure. Now, if you are running Windows Server 2003 domain controllers and Windows Server 2003 IIS servers, you can take advantage of something called Advanced Digest Authentication. With Advanced Digest Authentication, the passwords are stored on the domain controller as an MD5 hash and not in plain text. So to see if you're already running Advanced Digest Authentication, we'll need to open up a command prompt and we'll just change into our INET pub directory, followed by our admin scripts directory, and then we'll need to enter in the following command. So I'll just type that in there and we'll hit enter. And the result here is that the Advanced Digest Authentication mode isn't configured on this server. Okay, so to configure Advanced Digest Authentication, we'll go and click on Start and open up My Computer. We'll go to our C drive, our Windows directory. We'll scroll down and select our System32 directory. We'll scroll down a bit more and find our INET Serve directory. And then we'll need to locate our metabase.xml file. And we'll right click on that file and we'll open it up with Notepad. And I'll just expand this to make it a little easier to see. And now I'll hit Control F on my keyboard to bring up the Find dialog box and we'll type in IIS Web Server. Now we'll click on Find Next and we'll just scroll down so we can see all of this information right here. Okay, now if we go to the bottom of this selection here, I'm just going to hit enter and tab over a few times. And what we'll need to do is enter in a new line and we'll call it Use Digest SSP equals true. Now, if you don't happen to have the Edit Metabase while running option that's in effect, you'll need to restart your web server before the configuration of Advanced Digest Authentication will be complete. Now, I might also add, Even though we've just configured Advanced Digest Authentication and not the regular Digest Authentication, you still will need to check the Digest Authentication checkbox or it won't work. Now, once you check this box, you will get a message telling you that Digest Authentication only works with Active Directory. So do we want to continue? Well, I'll say yes. Now we'll need to fill in the realm which now becomes available. The realm is simply the domain in which the IIS 6 server is a member. So in our case, if we click on the select button, we can see our only choice here is testdomain.com and we'll choose OK. Now a final thing I should point out with regards to using regular Digest Authentication. Each user that needs to be authenticated must have a flag set on their user account. So we'll come down here and we'll click on Start, Administrative Tools, and then we'll launch Active Directory Users and Computers. Now what we need to do here is select a computer account, right click and select Properties, then select the Account tab. Now here under our account options we have an option to store password using reversible encryption. Now if this box is not checked, then users won't be able to be authenticated. Now if you are using Advanced Digest Authentication, you won't need to complete this step. Now to make this job a little easier, if it's only a handful of users you need to configure, you can either select a group by selecting one and then holding down the Shift key, or alternatively you can hold down the Control key and select each individual account, and then again right click on one of the selected accounts, choose Properties, and this brings up the Properties on Multiple Objects box. And again down here under our account options we can choose to store passwords using reversible encryption again. So we'll simply choose the left hand box, choose the right hand box, choose OK, and now both of these accounts do have that setting enabled. So again, if we right click on one of these accounts, select Properties, select the Account tab, down here we can see that change has been successful. Okay, now if you do need to manipulate more than just a few accounts, you could use Group Policy to set Digest Authentication. Now if we right click on our domain and select Properties, followed by the Group Policy tab, now for the sake of the argument here, I'm just going to edit our default domain policy. But in the real world, I'd suggest applying a policy like this at a more granular level, like the OU. But anyway, we'll click on Edit, and this will bring up the Group Policy Object Editor. Now under our computer configuration, we'll expand Windows Settings, Security Settings, Account Policies, and then finally we'll select our Password Policy. Now over here on the right, you can configure a group policy object to store passwords using reversible encryption. So if we double click on this policy, we can choose the box to define this policy and then just set it to enabled and click on OK. And that's it, a quick way of applying this change to a lot of users at once. Okay, well we'll just minimize all of these windows just here, so we'll go back to our IIS MMC. Now by the way, if you do happen to have all four of these authentication methods checked, Anonymous, Integrated, Digest and Basic, they will be applied in that order. Authentication is applied in order of strongest first, with the exception of course of the Anonymous authentication. So if a user logs on, IIS will attempt to use Anonymous authentication first. Now if that doesn't work, it will then try Integrated Windows authentication as it's the most secure of the remaining three. If it can't use Integrated authentication, it will then try Digest authentication, or of course Advanced Digest if you happen to have that configured. Finally, it will then go on and try Basic authentication. Now if that fails, the user then will be presented with a 403 error or access denied. Okay, the final authentication method available in this window is Dotnet Passport authentication. This option allows IIS 6 to let Microsoft's Dotnet Passport service store the user's credentials on another server, and that saves you from having to manage and maintain this task yourself. Now this service doesn't authorize users to access your site or content. It just merely provides a method of affirming that the user is who they claim to be in their Dotnet Passport profile. From there, what permissions they have on your site is still up to you to configure. Now if you're interested in learning more about the Dotnet Passport authentication system, simply point your browser to microsoft.com/net/services/passport/developer.asp, and you can download the Software Developers Kit and some useful information about setting this up on your server. Now I will point out though that this service is not free. It is free for a user to sign up, but if you want to utilize the Dotnet Passport to authenticate users on your web server, then you'll need to pay. Now when you select the Dotnet Passport authentication box, it automatically disables the other 3 authentication methods here as they're no longer applicable. However, do note that anonymous connections still do apply. Now once you set this box, you will need to then fill in the domain which now becomes available. So we'll come over here and click on the select button. Again, we'll choose testdomain.com and we'll choose OK. And that's it. Assuming you have signed up for this service with Microsoft and you've created your .NET login pages, you'd now be able to see a login page on your own server, somewhat similar to what you'd expect if you log onto a Hotmail account. So that's authentication. In this video, we've looked at the 5 authentication methods available in IIS 6. Anonymous, integrated, digest, and of course advanced digest authentication, which is only available if you do have Windows 2003 domain controllers and Windows 2003 web servers. And of course we looked at basic authentication and Microsoft's .NET Passport authentication. When choosing an authentication method, it's generally recommended that you go with the most secure option if possible. If you can only go with basic authentication, consider using SSL to encrypt the data. Controlling precisely which users are allowed to access your content makes your data all the more secure, and that is what authentication is all about.